The sun bled out across the high plains like a wound, turning the cracked bed of the dried Snake River into hammered bronze. Lakota let his Mustang pick its way along the rim, while two spare horses trailed behind on a frayed lead. The afternoon storm had scrubbed the sky clean and left a skin of water across the basin floor. Beautiful, treacherous, hiding mud that could swallow a man whole and leave no trace. He had been following wagon ruts and hoofprints for 3 days. They cut down into the riverbed and stopped cold as if the riders had been pulled straight into the earth's mouth. 50 yards out, 3 pale shapes lay motionless in the gray muck. Discarded cargo, he thought at first. Then he saw the curve of a shoulder blade, the bend of a knee, torn cotton clinging to bruised skin. His hand went to the Colt at his hip. Then one arm shot up from the ooze fingers clawing at empty air like a drowning woman's last prayer. The revolver was out before thought caught up aimed at that desperate hand. Every instinct screamed ambush, and this was how men died on the frontier, riding to rescue what looked like victims, only to take a rifle ball between the shoulder blades. But the arm trembled and began to sink back under. He counted 3 heartbeats, waiting for rifles to crack from the rocks. Nothing moved except that drowning hand, pale against the gray slime, already disappearing. He swung down hard boots, hitting packed earth. Grabbed his rope with hands that knew this work too well, his uncle's voice in his head, steady and cold. The mud is patient. It will wait for you to make a mistake. He knotted one end tight around his ribs and looped the other twice around his saddle horn. The Mustang knew this dance. Legs braced, haunches low, ready to haul dead weight out of hell or die trying. Lakota stepped into the mud. Cold slammed through his boots like a fist. The earth grabbed at him immediately, sucking, pulling alive with hunger. He moved sideways the way his uncle had taught him, weight shifting with each step, never planting both feet at once, reading the surface for firmness that might hold or softness that would kill. The arm was going under. He lunged forward, caught the wrist's small bones beneath slick skin, and pulled hard. The mud would not let go. It made sounds he would hear in nightmares for years after wet, obscene possessive. Inch by brutal inch, a shoulder emerged. Then a head caked in slime hair, plastered flat mouth, gasping like a landed fish. A woman's face, young beneath the filth. She coughed, vomited muddy water across his chest. When her eyes opened, they were the color of new leaves and wild with the kind of terror that comes from nearly dying alone and forgotten. He did not waste breath on comfort or explanations. Just dragged her to solid ground, turned, and went back. The second woman was deeper, almost gone. He had to go in past his waist to reach her, feeling the mud pull at his thighs with patient malevolence. By the time he hauled the third woman out, stars had punched through the darkening sky, and his arms shook like winter branches in a gale. The women lay in a heap on the cracked clay, bruised and shivering, wearing nothing but torn undergarments and layers of drying mud that cracked when they moved. The green-eyed one sat up first, scraping filth from her face with hands that would not stop trembling. She looked at him, at the eagle feathers woven into his black hair, at the beaded shirt and leggings that marked him as Lakota, at the Colt still holstered at his hip, and something in her face shifted. Not fear, calculation. When she could speak without her teeth rattling against each other, she said one word. Milena. Her accent was thick European, each syllable shaped with the careful precision of someone who had learned English from books rather than conversation. She studied him the way a wolf studies movement in the trees, deciding if he was predator-prey or something more complicated. Who did this? Drovers, hired by the Kensington agency to transport us west. She gestured weakly at the others. Ruth, Josefina? We answered marriage advertisements. Respectable husbands, they promised. Good homes in civilized towns. Her voice cracked. On the trail, they said we owed payment for passage. When we fought back, they took everything we had. Stripped us. dragged us here to this place. Said the mud would finish what they started, and no one would ever ask questions about 3 foreign women who disappeared between mail stops. Lakota studied her face in the failing light. Bruises darkened her throat in the unmistakable shape of fingers. Her collarbone showed sharp beneath torn fabric evidence of rough handling and missed meals. But her eyes held something harder than fear, a cold, calculating fury that reminded him of his uncle before a raid. This woman had survived by being smarter and meaner than the people trying to kill her. He reached into the pouch at his belt, and for just a moment, his fingers brushed against the small scrap of paper folded there, a child's drawing torn in half 4 years ago when soldiers came, and his sister Winona disappeared with a man carrying promises and official papers. He pushed the memory down where it could not touch him and pulled out a strip of dried meat instead. "Can you ride?" "Yes." The other 2 nodded, though the Irish girl Ruth looked ready to shatter at the next loud sound. The darker one, Josefina, met his gaze straight on, jaw set, already deciding whether to trust him based on what he did next, rather than what he said. He wrapped them in wool blankets from his pack, tied them secure so they would not fall if they fainted from exhaustion or shock, and led them through dry washes and deep shadows toward the distant glow of purgatory. The town sat 3 miles east, a collection of false front buildings and tents held together by whiskey and wishful thinking. When piano music drifted across the prairie from the saloons, he stopped to listen. Not for the music, for the sound of danger beneath it. A drunk miner stumbled from an alley, caught sight of the eagle feathers woven into Lakota's hair, and fumbled for the rifle slung across his back with hands made clumsy by rot-gut whiskey. Savage got himself some white women. "Silas, put the damn rifle down before you shoot your own foot off, and I have to saw it off for you." Dr. Hugh Kensington stepped into the lamplight, spilling from a nearby doorway. Lean as a whip, silver hair gleaming, carrying a worn medical bag that had seen more blood than most men could stomach without turning to drink. He was not related to the agency that bore his surname, just cursed to share it through cruel coincidence. He grabbed the rifle with surprising strength, twisted it out of drunk hands, shoved the miner back toward the saloon with more force than seemed possible from such a slender frame. Then he turned to Lakota. His face said he understood everything in a single glance: the mud-caked women, the exhaustion, the danger. Back door, right now, before anyone else sees. The clinic smelled of carbolic acid and old suffering, the particular scent of a place where people came to have wounds cleaned or babies delivered, or to die with some measure of dignity. Hugh bolted the door, set water to boil on the cast-iron stove, laid out clean shift gowns with the economical movements of a man who had done this too many times before. The women washed at the basin, scrubbing away layers of mud to reveal the damage beneath bruises. Rope burns the marks left by men who viewed them as cargo rather than human beings. Lakota stayed outside, back pressed to the rough boards, rifle laid across his knees. Through the thin walls he could hear quiet weeping and the splash of water. Hugh's low voice speaking words of comfort he probably did not believe anymore. The sounds made something tighten in his chest, a memory of his sister Winona, 17 years old, with her whole life spread before her like an unread map. Leaving with a man who had papers and promises of marriage to a shopkeeper in Colorado Territory. That was 4 years ago. No one had seen her since, though Lakota had followed every rumor tract, every whisper turned over every rock looking for trace of her. The U.S. Marshal who had hired him, a man named Calhoun, who operated 2 territories away and had eyes like chips of flint, had mentioned a ring that bought and sold women along mail routes where questions were never asked, and local sheriffs looked the other way for the right price. Find the route, Calhoun had said, counting out silver dollars onto a scarred table. Find the proof. Bring it back and we will burn them down to ash and salt the earth after. Now Lakota had 3 survivors, 3 witnesses. and no safe way to keep them breathing long enough to testify in any court that would listen to women over sheriffs. Dawn found him still awake, watching the stars fade into pale morning sky. He went inside. Milena sat propped against Pillow's damp hair, falling loose around her shoulders in dark waves. Bruises ringed her throat like a necklace of ugly flowers, 5 distinct fingerprints on each side. She watched him the way a card sharp watches the deal looking for, tells for weakness, for advantage. "The horses," she said without preamble, no wasted words. "The drover's horses. Do you still have them tied outside?" He went to the alley. In strengthening daylight, he found what her sharp mind had retained even while drowning a brand on the bay mare's flank. Crooked K over A, the lines uneven and hasty, burned in by someone who did not care about craftsmanship. He had seen that mark before, faint in the dust 2 days back, near a burned-out stagecoach. When he returned inside, Milena was holding something up to the light streaming through the window. A small brass key on a broken leather cord tarnished green with age. "The one who held me under wore this around his neck. It came off when I clawed at him." She turned it so he could see the initials stamped into the metal KA. "Before they left us to die, I heard him tell the others that the next batch would be sorted at the old mine north of town before being moved to buyers in California." Lakota took the key, felt its weight in his palm. Cold metal. Evidence. "You remember that clearly while drowning." Her mouth thinned to a hard line. "I remember everything, every word, every face. I will forget nothing until every one of them hangs." He studied her a moment longer, the set of her jaw, the way her hands had stopped shaking, and now rested steady on her knees, and recognized someone who had survived by being smarter and more ruthless than the people trying to kill her. He nodded once and went back outside into morning light. The main street of purgatory was waking up around him like a diseased thing crawling from its grave. Shopkeepers swept boardwalks with mechanical movements. Women drew water from the town pump, keeping their eyes down. Men stumbled from saloons, squinting at daylight like it was a personal insult. Lakota kept his head down, moved quiet, made himself small. Halfway down the street, he found the sign, polished wood gold lettering catching early sun. Kensington arrangements. Respectable matches for discerning gentlemen. Through the window, he saw a man in an expensive suit feeding papers into a cast-iron stove with the jerky urgency of someone destroying evidence before dawn. The man moved fast, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds, like a coyote at a kill. Black smoke poured from the stove, carrying the acrid stink of burning ink and secrets turning to ash. Lakota memorized every detail, sharp features, slicked hair gleaming with pomade gold watch chain stretched across a silk vest, manicured hands that had never done hard labor. Then he walked back to the clinic and sat at Hugh's scarred table. He pulled out a stub of pencil and began sketching what he had seen with the careful precision his uncle had taught him for tracking. The brand, the key, the man and his stove. Not proof that would stand in any territorial court, but a thread. Pull hard enough and the whole rotten tapestry might unravel. That night, just after midnight, when the town had finally fallen into drunken sleep, someone came for them. Lakota heard the back door's iron hinge give the faintest creak, barely a whisper of sound, but enough. He was moving before his eyes fully opened, coming up off the floor in one fluid motion, rifle in hand. The door swung inward, slowly, deliberately. A broad man in a dusty coat stepped through, carrying a coiled rope over one arm and a burlap sack clutched in his other hand. His eyes went straight to Milena's cot, where she lay with her back to the door, apparently asleep. Lakota kicked the door into the man's shoulder. Hard. The intruder stumbled sideways with a grunt of surprised pain, swore viciously, lunged forward anyway, with the desperate strength of someone who knew failure meant losing his payment. They collided between the narrow cots, crashing into the table hard enough to splinter wood. A kerosene lamp hit the floor with a sound like breaking crystal. Glass exploded. Oil spread in a dark pool. Fire bloomed across the floorboards with a hungry whoosh. Hugh jerked awake with a startled shout, grabbed the nearest wool blanket, beat frantically at spreading flames while the two men fought. The intruder was heavier, fueled by desperation or money or both. He pulled a Bowie knife from his belt, wicked curve of steel with a bone handle worn smooth by use, and drove it upward toward Odakota's ribs in a killing thrust. Odakota twisted his body hard, felt the blade slice across his left forearm instead of plunging through his chest. Pain bloomed hot and immediate, like someone had laid a burning brand against his skin. Blood welled up fast, soaked through his sleeve in seconds. He hooked his leg behind the man's knee, used his momentum and weight to drive him backward, slammed the hand, holding the knife against the cast-iron stove leg with bone-breaking force. Something cracked with a sound like green wood snapping. The knife clattered away across blood-slicked floorboards. The man screamed high and animal and bolted out the back door into darkness, cradling his ruined wrist against his chest. Odakota let him go. Chasing would only draw more attention, more danger, more questions no one wanted answered. He bent down, breathing hard through clenched teeth, tasting copper in his mouth, and picked up the burlap sack the man had dropped in his haste to escape. Inside was a folded paper edges, worn soft from handling. He spread it on the table with hands that left red smears on the yellowed surface. A ledger page lined and numbered. Names written in neat columns with the kind of precise penmanship they taught in expensive Eastern schools. Milena Kowalski, Ruth O'Brien, Josefina Reyes. Each followed by a date of departure, a town of origin, a sum of money that made his stomach turn. At the bottom of the page, in that same careful script, initials DK and the words, "Delivered as agreed. Payment received in full." Milena took the page from his blood-stained hands. Read it slowly, lips moving slightly with each damning line. All color drained from her face until she looked like a ghost sitting there in her borrowed nightgown. Someone in this town bought us, like horses at auction, like cattle for slaughter. Hugh was wrapping Odakota's arm with strips of clean linen hands, steady despite everything that had just happened. Years of practice keeping them that way. If this document is genuine, and I have no reason to doubt it, then powerful men are implicated in women being bought and sold. They will do anything to bury this evidence. Burn it, drown it, kill anyone who has seen it. He tied off the bandage with a final sharp tug. You are all in terrible danger now. Blood soaked through the white linen, almost immediately spreading like a red flower. Odakota looked down at it and knew with cold certainty that the night's violence was just the opening move in a much longer and deadlier game. By sunrise, Sheriff Franklin "Fuzzy" Frank Harrow stood in the clinic surrounded by a dozen miners who reeked of stale whiskey and sleepless nights. Franklin was a broad man, running to fat, his beard stained brown, from years of chewing tobacco, his tarnished star pinned crooked to a vest straining at its buttons. He listened to Milena's careful account of the attack, with visible impatience, his jaw working constantly, as if chewing something bitter he could not spit out. When she finished speaking, he turned slowly to face Odakota, with eyes like a pig's, small, mean, calculating. "What we have here," he announced loud enough for everyone in the room and half the street outside to hear clearly, "is a savage dragging half-dressed white women into our decent, God-fearing town, and then brutally attacking an honest citizen who came to check on their welfare out of Christian charity. That man broke into my clinic in the dead of night, carrying rope and a sack." Hughes said, his voice sharp as a surgical blade. "I saw him with my own eyes. That was no act of charity." Franklin ignored him completely, as if the doctor had not spoken at all. He gestured at the injured intruder, a man named Tucker, who sat slumped dramatically in a wooden chair, with his wrist splinted and his face twisted into an expression of theatrical suffering that would have shamed a bad actor. Tucker here says he heard women screaming, came running to help like any decent man would, and got jumped by this savage for his trouble. Nearly killed him. Might never work again with that hand. That is an absolute lie. Milena held up the ledger page with both hands, holding it steady despite the trembling that wanted to take over her whole body. He came for this. Evidence of women being bought and sold. Names and money and dates. Proof. Franklin barely glanced at it. Could be anything. Laundry accounts. Gambling debts recorded by some fool. Could be you wrote it yourself with the doctor's help to create a story. He turned deliberately to address the assembled miners, directly playing to his audience like a practiced politician. What I know for certain, what we all know, is we have a Lakota warrior in full regalia, carrying deadly weapons in a town full of decent white folks, just trying to make honest livings. And now there is blood spilled on the floor, and a man with a shattered wrist who may never work again and support his family. Hang him! Someone in the crowd shouted with drunken enthusiasm. Others took up the cry immediately. Hang him! Hang him! The word spread through the group like fire through dry grass, each man feeding the next, until it became a chant. Franklin did not calm them or call for order. He fed their rage with calculated silence, letting it build like steam in a boiler. Finally, he raised one meaty hand. We will have proper order and lawful procedure in this town. We will conduct a fair trial at dawn tomorrow morning, then carry out whatever sentence the law requires. No one will ever say that purgatory tolerates savages attacking our citizens and getting away with it. Two burly deputies grabbed Odakota's arms before he could move, wrenched them roughly behind his back with unnecessary force. Iron manacles snapped shut around his wrists with a sound like a closing coffin. For your own protection, Franklin said with utterly false solicitude playing to the crowd. That mob outside is mighty angry. Can't have them tearing you apart in the street before justice is properly served according to law. There would be no trial. Everyone in that overcrowded room knew it with absolute certainty. This was a lynching dressed up in the borrowed clothes of territorial justice. They dragged him into the dusty street through the back door. The crowd followed like wolves, scenting blood, shouting threats and insults, calling for rope and justice in equal measure. A whiskey bottle smashed against the wall near his head, spraying sharp glass fragments across his shoulders and neck, drawing thin lines of blood. If Hugh and Milena had not walked determinedly on either side of him, deliberately using their bodies as shields against the mob's fury, he would have been beaten to death before they reached the stone jailhouse at the end of the street. The cells stank of old fear and fresh urine, and decades of suffering absorbed into the walls. Franklin shoved him inside hard enough to make him stumble and fall to his knees on the dirt floor, locked the heavy iron door with an ostentatious turn of the key, and walked away, without a backward glance or word of explanation. Through the single barred window set high in the wall, Odakota watched the crowd disperse slowly into morning light, reluctantly still muttering darkly about justice and hemp rope and teaching savages their proper place. After full dark had fallen and the town had quieted into drunken sleep, Milena came back. She slipped through the alley entrance like a shadow bribed the half-drunk deputy with a bottle Hugh had provided specifically for this purpose, and sat cross-legged on the floor outside the bars. From her pocket she pulled a piece of charcoal stolen from the clinic stove and began writing on the whitewashed wall in short, simple English sentences that even a child could read. I was hired by a federal marshal named Calhoun to track the men who buy and sell women. These women were deliberately abandoned in the riverbed to drown. The Kensington Agency sells women for profit across 3 territories. She reached through the bars without asking permission. took his hand, her fingers small and strong, and surprisingly warm against his palm, and guided it over each word, making him trace the letters again and again, until muscle memory began to form, and the shapes started to make sense. They will not listen if you cannot speak their language exactly the way they demand to hear it. She said, her voice flat and practical, stripped of emotion. So we make you sharp enough to cut through their lies and assumptions. No tenderness in her tone, no pity or sympathy, just cold practicality born of necessity. Two people forging a weapon together from desperation and intelligence. Why risk this? He asked, quietly, genuinely puzzled by her determination. You could leave tonight. Take a horse and ride east to Denver where it is safer. Forget any of this happened. Start over somewhere and no one knows your face or your story. She met his eyes through the bars without blinking. In the dim lamplight, her face was all sharp angles and deep shadows, beautiful and hard at the same time. Because if they hang you tomorrow at dawn, the truth dies with you. The men who buy and sell women keep on with their trade. More women get sold and drowned and forgotten like yesterday's garbage. She paused, jaw tightening. I will not allow that to happen. Not while I still draw breath. You could still run. So could you. She held his gaze without flinching. But here you are. He had no answer for that simple truth. While Lakota waited in his cell for the hanging everyone knew was coming, the town began to shift in small ways that meant everything to those paying attention. Ruth, pale and shaking like an autumn leaf, accepted a marriage proposal from Carl, a quiet German farmer from Prairie Dawn who had ridden to purgatory looking for a wife and offered safety and protection with the blunt honesty of a lonely man who had spent too many winters alone in a cold cabin. She left before dawn in a borrowed wagon, wrapped in a thick coat against the chill heading east toward something resembling hope. Her departure only underscored Milena's deliberate choice to stay behind and fight. Josefina flatly refused to leave town. Her younger sister Maria might be in the next shipment of women being sold like freight, she told Hugh while grinding dried herbs for his medicines with steady hands. She had heard one of the drovers mention Las Cruces before they stripped her. She would not abandon the search for her sister, would not run to safety while Maria might still be found and saved. One quiet evening, while mending her ruined dress by lamplight, she discovered another ledger page sewn carefully into the torn hem with thread that matched the fabric almost perfectly. Same handwriting, same damning initials. D.K. Hugh took both precious pages to Harriet, the schoolteacher. She was a severe woman in her middle 40s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, and a well-earned reputation for asking uncomfortable questions that made powerful men squirm in their chairs. She compared the handwriting on the ledger pages to a receipt she had carefully saved from the Kensington Arrangements office months earlier, after a suspicious inquiry about a missing student. The match was perfect, every loop and curve identical. Dorian Kensington, she said quietly, her voice tight with controlled fury. Hugh, you share a surname with an absolute monster who profits from human misery. Hugh's weathered face went pale as old bone. I know, and I mean to help stop him whatever the personal cost. Deputy Eric Larson had been conducting his own quiet investigation in the shadows. He was a tall Swede with haunted blue eyes and hands that trembled slightly when he thought no one was watching closely enough to notice. Late one night, he stood hidden in deep shadows across the street from the Kensington Arrangements office and watched through the window as Sheriff Franklin paid Dorian a visit. Money changed hands with casual ease, a thick stack of bills that Franklin counted slowly, licking his thumb between each one. Then Franklin handed over a folded paper with an official-looking territorial seal pressed into red wax. Their laughter carried clearly in the quiet night air, the sound of men who believed themselves completely untouchable by consequences. Eric had lost a niece to a marriage advertisement 3 years back. She had been young and hopeful, excited about her new life in America. She had vanished somewhere along a mail route in Dakota Territory, swallowed up without trace. He had told himself at the time that the authorities surely knew what they were doing, that he should not interfere in official business, that asking too many questions might cost him his position. Now, watching Franklin and Kensington celebrate their bloody profits like it was just another successful business transaction, he finally understood with crushing clarity exactly what his silence and cowardice had cost. Just after midnight, when even the saloons had finally gone quiet, Eric unlocked Odakota's cell with shaking hands and stepped inside the small space. The cell was barely large enough for both of them. He sat heavily on the edge of the narrow wooden cot that smelled of old sweat and fear. "Franklin needs you to be the monster in this story," he said in heavily accented English, each word carefully chosen. "He will hang you publicly to protect the trade in women and make himself look like a hero of law and order. But I have heard talk drovers who drink too much and speak too freely about an abandoned mine on the North Ridge, where they sort women before moving them to buyers in California. If we can get there and bring back real proof, living witnesses, actual captives, undeniable evidence, we might be able to turn this whole terrible thing around." "Why help me?" Odakota asked, searching the deputy's anguished face for deception and finding only raw guilt and desperate determination. "What do you gain?" Eric's jaw clenched hard enough that muscles jumped beneath his pale skin. 3 years ago, I did not help my niece when she needed someone to ask hard questions and demand real answers. I convinced myself that I should trust the system, should not interfere with proper authorities, should keep my head down and my mouth shut. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Now I have to live every single day knowing that my cowardice might have killed her. Maybe I cannot bring her back from wherever she ended up. But maybe, just maybe, I can save someone else's sister before it is too late. Maybe that will be enough to let me sleep again someday. Nonker. Hugh arranged the transfer 2 days later with careful lies and manufactured urgency. He convinced Franklin that a territorial judge in Fort Laramie required the prisoner for formal arraignment before a proper magistrate, that transporting him under armed guard would help avoid the kind of mob violence that reflected poorly on territorial governance and sometimes drew unwanted federal attention. Franklin, always eager to appear lawful and proper for any outside observers who might be watching grudgingly, agreed to the arrangement. Odakota was chained at both hands and feet, like a rabid animal loaded roughly into a canvas-covered wagon, with Eric and another deputy serving as armed escort. Milena insisted with steel in her voice on riding alongside them, despite the danger the precious ledger pages hidden deep in her boot, where no casual search would find them. Hugh followed on his steady gray mare medical bag, strapped securely across his saddle in case things went badly. 2 hours north of Purgatory, following a narrow trail that wound between towering formations of rust-colored rock rifles cracked sharply from the high ground above them. The first bullet punched through canvas directly above Odakota's head, so close he felt the heat of its passage against his scalp like a branding iron. The wagon lurched violently as the terrified driver hauled hard on the reins with all his strength. More shots followed in rapid succession, sharp cracks echoing off stone walls, kicking up geysers of dirt, filling the air with the acrid smell of gunpowder and mortal danger. Eric leaped to his feet in the exposed wagon bed, returning fire with his revolver and shouting desperately for everyone to take cover immediately. Odakota did not hesitate. He threw himself sideways out of the moving wagon, still chained like livestock, hit the hard ground with brutal force that drove air from his lungs, rolled down a steep slope through thorns and sharp rocks that tore at his clothes and skin. A deputy in a long duster scrambled down after him with surprising agility, Winchester rifle held ready to kill. Odakota kicked out hard with both feet together, swept the man's legs from under him with satisfying impact. They tumbled together in a tangle of limbs toward a crumbling ravine edge that dropped away into nothing. Odakota hooked his boot desperately around an exposed tree root, just in time to stop their deadly slide into the drop below. Momentum nearly tore his leg from its socket, but the root held. They fought savagely in the dirt and scattered rocks, both men grappling for control of the rifle, while death waited inches away. The deputy was heavier and fought with the desperate strength of someone who knew failure meant not getting paid. But Lakota had trained for close combat since childhood, under his uncle's brutal tutelage. He got his chained wrists hooked around the man's thick throat from behind and squeezed with methodical, relentless pressure, kept squeezing until the violent struggling gradually weakened and finally stopped entirely. He tore open the unconscious man's coat with clumsy chained hands and searched frantically through the pockets. In the inner vest pocket, he found a telegram with an official territorial seal and impressive letterhead, Fugitives, Lakota, wanted for horse theft, assault with deadly weapon, and murder of a federal officer. Bounty of $200 in silver payable upon delivery to any territorial authority, dead or alive. Complete fabrication. Legal murder dressed up in official language and pressed into red wax. But the fight had cost him dearly. During their violent tumble down the slope, a sharp outcrop of rock had gouged deep into his right side, just below the ribs, tearing through cloth and flesh alike. When he pressed his chained hands against the wound, blood welled hot and fast between his fingers, soaking through his shirt in an expanding dark stain that looked black in the shadows. His vision swam at the edges, doubling and blurring. Eric scrambled down the slope, took one look at the wound, and ripped a long strip from his own shirt without hesitation to bind it as tight as possible. That needs proper stitching by someone who knows what they are doing. Real medical attention. Later, Lakota's voice came out strained and thin, barely recognizable. Mine first. If we turn back now, Franklin wins everything and more women die. You could easily bleed to death before we even reach the mine. Then we move fast and hope luck favors us for once. The abandoned Crimson Star silver mine was a black wound carved into the hillside, surrounded by the skeletal remains of failed dreams and broken ambitions, rotted timber supports that groaned in the wind, rusted equipment scattered like bones in the weeds, collapsed shafts that breathed cold air smelling of earth and old dynamite and something darker. They approached at dusk, when shadows were longest, moving quiet as ghosts through scrub brush and scattered boulders, staying low. 5 of them now Harriet had insisted on coming, despite the obvious danger, saying firmly that she would be damned to hell before she let men make all the important decisions about women's lives and futures. They climbed carefully to the old timber gallery above the main sorting chamber, a precarious platform that groaned ominously under their combined weight and threatened to collapse at any moment. Settled in to wait. Lakota's wounded side throbbed with each heartbeat, a steady drumbeat of pain. Fever was building behind his eyes, like storm clouds making the world shimmer and waver at the edges of his vision. Just before the sun touched the western horizon and painted everything blood red, riders appeared in the clearing far below. The first group was led by a thin man with predator's eyes and a face weathered to cracked leather by decades of hard living under merciless sun. His name was Rudolph, though men along the frontier called him Prairie Hawk, for the patient circling way he approached dying things until he could claim them safely. He rode with 5 hard-faced men who looked like they had been born with guns in their hands, all scanning the surrounding rocks with the professional caution of men who killed for money and slept soundly afterward. Rudolph pulled out a crumpled telegram of the same false warrant and waved it for his crew to see clearly in the fading light. Territorial governor himself confirms it, official and legal. One Lakota named Lakota wanted for murdering a federal officer in cold blood. $200 in silver coin payable on delivery. Sheriff Harrow says the whole town will turn out to watch us bring him in for proper hanging. Easiest money we ever made, boys. The second group arrived only moments later, announced by the sound of hoofbeats and jingling harness, Sheriff Franklin himself, with 6 more armed riders flanking him. And beside him rode a gentleman in expensive tailored clothes, carefully trimmed beard hair, slicked back with pomade gold watch chain, catching the last rays of sunlight like a beacon. Dorian Kensington. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man who believed himself utterly untouchable by law or consequence. Money changed hands in the open, without any attempt at concealment or shame. Franklin counted the thick stack of bills with methodical care, licking his thumb between each one like a banker, while Kensington spoke in a calm, businesslike tone that somehow made his words more chilling than any amount of shouting could have achieved. The incident at the river was unfortunate, but ultimately manageable. 3 women lost, yes, but such losses happen regularly in this harsh country and rarely attract sustained attention. The real problem, the only problem that truly matters at this point, is the savage and the women who survived to tell inconvenient stories. As long as they continue breathing and talking, the narrative spreads like disease. We need the Lakota blamed publicly for everything: kidnapping, assault, the selling of women, murder, if necessary to make the story convincing. Then we hang him in front of as many witnesses as we can gather from surrounding territories. After that public spectacle, the surviving women will have absolutely no credibility whatsoever. They will be dismissed as traumatized victims whose minds were addled and confused by their ordeal at the hands of a savage. Our business can then continue without further interruption or inconvenient questions. Franklin nodded slowly, methodically, tucking the blood money into his vest with satisfaction. Public hanging is scheduled for dawn tomorrow. Already sent word to neighboring towns. Expecting quite a large crowd. We will make it a show this territory remembers for years to come. Their plan was brutally simple in its evil efficiency frame: Lakota. For the entire ring that traded in women, execute him as public theater with maximum spectacle. Permanently discredit the surviving women as unreliable witnesses suffering from trauma, then continue selling human beings for profit as if nothing had happened. In the gallery high above, Milena's hand closed around Lakota's wrist with crushing force. Her fingers dug into his skin hard enough to leave marks. They needed to leave immediately, right now, before being spotted. But then, old timber beneath Josefina's shifting weight gave a sharp crack that echoed through the vast chamber below, like a gunshot in a cathedral. Every head snapped upward in perfect unison, faces turning toward the sound. "There," someone shouted, pointing directly at their hiding place with damning accuracy. Rifles swung toward the gallery with deadly precision. The first bullet smashed into a beam directly above Lakota's head, spraying wooden splinters like shrapnel. Eric grabbed Harriet's arm and physically dragged her toward the narrow exit at the far end of the gallery, firing his revolver blindly behind them to provide some measure of covering fire. Josefina ran, stumbling over loose boards that shifted treacherously beneath her feet. Lakota stayed behind without hesitation, raised his own revolver despite the screaming agony radiating from his wounded side, like fire fired carefully and deliberately at horses and hats and anything else that might draw attention and give the others precious seconds to escape with their lives. He fired until the hammer clicked uselessly on empty chambers, then turned to follow them toward the exit. He made it perhaps 5 steps before rough hands grabbed him from behind. Multiple sets of hands, too many to fight. A rifle butt cracked across the back of his skull with sickening force. The world exploded into white light, so bright it burned, then collapsed utterly into absolute darkness that swallowed everything. When consciousness reluctantly returned, dragging him back from the void against his will, he found himself chained hand and foot, like an animal in the back of a supply wagon, staring up at cold stars that swam drunkenly in and out of focus. His head throbbed with sick, pulsing pain that made thinking difficult. His wounded side felt like someone had shoved a burning brand between his ribs and left it there to smolder. Each shallow breath was a battle against agony. Fever climbed higher, making the cold night air feel simultaneously like ice and fire against his skin. From her hiding place in the jagged rocks high above the mine entrance, Milena watched through tears of helpless rage as Sheriff Franklin shook hands with Dorian Kensington directly over Dakota's unconscious body, like they were sealing any ordinary business deal. She memorized every detail with cold precision. Their faces, the brands on their horses, the way they laughed, as if this were merely another profitable transaction rather than conspiracy to murder. Then she turned and ran through gathering darkness to find the others and plan their desperate countermove. That night, Rudolph's camp sat in a tight ring of firelight on the open prairie miles from any town or potential witness. Dakota lay near the flames, chained to an iron stake driven deep into hard ground, with a sledgehammer unable to move more than a few inches in any direction. His wounded side had finally stopped bleeding, but the flesh around the gash was hot and swollen, infection setting in with ugly efficiency despite Eric's makeshift bandage. Fever climbed steadily higher, making the stars overhead blur and multiply into strange constellations that made no sense. Rudolph sat comfortably across from him, methodically cleaning his rifle with an oiled rag, talking in a low conversational tone about practical matters. Fort Laramie pays full bounty for a recognizable body. Did you know that? Same $200, whether you are breathing or already cold. And bodies I have found do not try to escape during transport. Do not talk back or cause difficulties. Do not require feeding or watching during the night. He looked up from his rifle barrel with eyes like chips of stone. Something worth considering as we ride tomorrow. Dakota said nothing, conserving what little strength he had left. He tested the chains with minute, careful movements and found them secured with professional competence by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. He was not breaking free without outside help that might never come. But that help was closer than Rudolph knew or could possibly imagine. Milena, Josephina, Harriet, Eric, and one more, a 10-year-old native boy named Tala, who they had found 3 days earlier hiding, terrified in the wreckage of an ambushed stagecoach, shadowed the camp from careful distance, moving in absolute silence through the darkness like hunting wolves. Tala had been sold by men who dealt in human beings twice already in his short, brutal life. He had learned to survive by becoming invisible, by reading the land better than grown men, with decades more experience, by trusting absolutely no one until they proved themselves worthy through consistent action rather than empty words. He knew where water ran hidden in this dry country, where mud waited to trap the unwary and careless, where the best approaches and escape routes lay. They will kill him well before dawn, Eric whispered urgently, watching the camp through a narrow gap in the rocks. We need to move right now, while we still have darkness. Milena shook her head with absolute certainty, jaw set like stone. We need more than just a rescue that leaves us running for our lives. We need the complete ledger, the full accounting with all names and payments and destinations, not just torn pages that can be dismissed as forgeries. If we simply take Dakota and run, Franklin will hunt us relentlessly across 3 territories with legal warrants, and we will never be truly safe. She had watched Dorian Kensington carefully carry a locked leather satchel into the camp earlier that evening, treating it like it contained something precious. The kind of satchel that required a key. The same kind of brass key she still carried in her pocket, taken from the drover who had tried to drown her. Just before dawn, when the fire had burned down to sullen red coals and the guards were fighting heavy-lidded sleep. After a long night, Milena made her decision. She stood, slowly brushed dust from her borrowed skirt with deliberate care, and walked directly into the camp with her head held high and her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders against the pre-dawn chill. She moved with the confident, unhurried purpose of someone who had every right to be exactly where she was. Someone with authority who answered to no one present. Rudolph jerked awake instantly, hand going to his revolver with practiced speed. Who in the hell are you, and how did you get past my sentries? Milena's face remained completely impassive, showing no fear whatsoever. When she spoke, her accent somehow lent the lie strange credibility, made it sound official and foreign, and therefore trustworthy. I am an auditor sent by the Kensington Organization's central office in San Francisco to verify the prisoner's identity and conduct a thorough review of all payment arrangements before final delivery and fund transfer. There have been significant discrepancies discovered in the financial records that require immediate clarification and resolution. Rudolph stood slowly studying her with deep suspicion and narrowed eyes. The organization never sends a woman to do this kind of field work, never sends anyone alone to remote camps. This smells wrong. She allowed herself a thin, cold smile that never reached her eyes. They sent me precisely because I do not attract the kind of attention and scrutiny that men inevitably draw. I can move freely through towns and camps without arousing suspicion or alarm. It is quite effective. She nodded casually toward where Lakota lay chained and barely conscious. Is that the prisoner specified in the contract documents? Rudolph's eyes narrowed to dangerous slits. He stepped close, much too close, violating her space deliberately to intimidate. His hand shot out and grabbed her arm with bruising force, fingers digging cruelly into her flesh. I think you are lying through your teeth, lady. I think you are one of those women from the river who should have stayed drowned. But Milena had already calculated. Every move had already seen what she desperately needed, within desperate reach. She let herself stagger dramatically, as if roughly pushed used that manufactured momentum to reach behind her with her free hand, and grabbed the locked leather satchel hanging from Dorian Kensington's saddle, just barely within frantic reach. She tore her arm free from Rudolph's grip, with a violent twisting motion that left skin and blood behind, and ran toward the rocks with everything she had. Gunfire erupted immediately behind her, deafening in the pre-dawn stillness. Bullets kicked up geysers of dirt at her heels, tore completely through her shawl, leaving smoking holes came so terrifyingly close, she felt their heat against her skin like brands. From concealment deep in the rocks, Eric and Josefina opened fire in return, forcing Rudolph's men to dive frantically for cover and disrupting their aim just enough. Tala's sharp whistle cut through the chaos, their carefully prearranged signal. A spotted pony appeared as if by magic from a hidden gully where he had been waiting. Milena grabbed desperately for the saddle horn, missed entirely, grabbed again, with terror lending her strength she did not know she possessed, and finally hauled herself up onto the animal's back. She kicked hard. The pony bolted toward the distant river, carrying her and the stolen ledger away from immediate death. But Rudolph had recovered faster than any of them had anticipated or planned for. He raised his rifle with practiced ease, sighted carefully and calmly, on Milena's fleeing back, his finger beginning to tighten methodically on the trigger to make the killing shot. Lakota, still chained helplessly to the iron stake and unable to stand or fight, made his choice in that frozen instant. He rolled his entire body deliberately and with great effort into the direct line of fire between Rudolph's rifle muzzle and Milena's vulnerable back. Made himself the obstacle that could not be ignored or shot through. Dirt and rocks exploded violently around him as bullets sought his flesh. One round grazed his shoulder, burning like a hot iron laid against bare skin. But he held his position stubbornly, refusing to move, buying Milena the precious seconds she desperately needed to reach safety and escape with the evidence that would destroy them all. Rudolph finally kicked him viciously in his wounded side, a calculated blow, designed specifically to inflict maximum agony and punishment. The world exploded into white light, and then went completely black for several seconds. When vision slowly returned, swimming and distorted, Rudolph was shouting furious orders at his men. Break this camp immediately, mount up. We ride hard for the dried Snake River right now. Franklin is already waiting there with his mob and gallows. We will finish this business properly in front of witnesses and collect our damn money. They threw Lakota into the supply wagon like a sack of worthless grain chains clanking against wood, and whipped the horses into a brutal, punishing gallop toward the river and the waiting noose and the end of everything. Morning light revealed the dried Snake River exactly as it truly was, a treacherous expanse of cracked clay plates, separated by deceptive channels of standing water that concealed bottomless mud beneath its innocent surface ground that had swallowed wagons and livestock, and occasionally unwary men who wandered too far from solid earth and safety. On the eastern bank, Sheriff Franklin stood with nearly 40 armed townsmen, miners, shopkeepers, drovers, drifters, anyone who could hold a rifle and wanted to see a hanging all whipped into self-righteous fury by generous amounts of whiskey, carefully crafted lies, and the irresistible promise of witnessing frontier justice carried out properly. A crude gallows constructed from rough cottonwood beams waited like a patient executioner, hemp ropes already tied with professional hangman's knots. On the western side, Rudolph's wagon rolled forward with terrible inevitability, forcing panicked horses onto increasingly unstable ground. The wagon carried Lakota barely conscious, and 6 newly captured women with bound wrists, their faces hollow with exhaustion, and the certain knowledge that they were being transported to something worse than death. But Melena's group had arrived hours earlier in the deepest darkness before dawn, when even the guards were drowsing, and had spent those precious stolen hours preparing the battlefield with desperate precision born of necessity. They had studied the terrain carefully by starlight, identified the softest spots and most treacherous ground, set their elaborate trap with the kind of attention to detail that meant the difference between justice and massacre. As Rudolph's wagon rolled down into the basin, the wheels immediately began sinking into mud, hidden just beneath the water's deceptive shine. The captured women screamed in terror. Rudolph cracked his whip savagely and continuously cursing in 3 languages, trying desperately to force the panicked horses forward through ground that grew softer and more unstable with every step. On the ridge high above, Eric stood fully visible in the strengthening light and cracked a long bullwhip with explosive force that echoed across the basin like artillery fire. In the narrow draw carefully positioned behind him, a dozen nervous horses that had been held ready bolted as one eyes rolling white with manufactured terror, and thundered down across the riverbed in a chaotic stampede that scattered Rudolph's carefully organized formation like a child's toys. Riders were knocked bodily from their saddles. Horses collided with sickening impact, reared in panic, stumbled blindly into hidden mud pockets, and began sinking immediately with terrified screams. Franklin roared desperately for order, waving his arms frantically like a madman trying to restore discipline and control to his rapidly disintegrating mob. He kicked his own horse forward aggressively to the very edge of the basin, where absolutely everyone could see him clearly and be reassured by his presence. Hold your positions, form a line. This is still the law operating here. The supply wagon gave a sickening, grinding lurch as both rear wheels sank deep into treacherously soft mud, hidden just beneath the surface water. The violent jolt threw 3 of the captive women out bodily into the shallow water and deeper mud beneath. They hit with despairing screams, hands still bound helplessly behind their backs, and immediately began sinking into the bottomless ooze. But this time, Harriet and Josefina were ready and waiting. They appeared on the stable bank with coiled ropes already in hand, threw them with desperate accuracy born of hours of secret practice, and began hauling the women toward solid ground, even as the hungry mud fought viciously to keep what it had claimed. On the highest point of the ridge overlooking everything, Melena stood alone and defiant, with the stolen leather satchel held high above her head, where absolutely everyone below could see it clearly in the morning light. These are your real criminals. Her voice cut through the chaos and confusion with surprising strength and clarity. She pointed an accusing finger directly at Franklin, at Dorian Kensington, who stood beside the sheriff, looking suddenly pale and trapped. They sell women exactly like livestock at auction, They pay drovers by the head for human cargo transported like animals, and they will hang an innocent man to hide their profitable crimes and protect that vile trade. The U.S. Marshal finally arrived after days of brutal hard riding following Hugh's desperate telegrams sent from every town with a working telegraph office, appeared suddenly at Milena's side like an avenging angel. His federal badge gleamed prominently in the strengthening sunlight, catching and throwing back the light like a mirror. His voice carried the full weight of federal authority when he spoke. "Sheriff Franklin Harrow, you are hereby ordered to stand down immediately and surrender your weapons. You and Mr. Dorian Kensington are both under official federal investigation for women being bought and sold conspiracy to commit murder and accessory to multiple homicides across territorial lines." Some of the townsmen immediately lowered their weapons suddenly and acutely unwilling to fight against federal law and risk hanging themselves. Others hesitated uncertainly, looking back and forth between Franklin's red, furious face and the marshal's cold badge of authority, no longer certain which side actually represented justice and which represented corruption. Franklin saw Milena holding that damning satchel high and understood with sudden, terrible clarity that everything he had built over years was collapsing around him in this muddy riverbed, that his profitable arrangement was ending right here, right now. His face twisted with desperate rage and animal panic. He swung his rifle down and around sharply, not aiming at Milena on the distant ridge where she was protected, but pointing the muzzle directly down at the drowning women being slowly hauled from the sucking mud. If the witnesses died here in the chaos, the ledger was just paper and ink. Without living testimony, there was no prosecutable case. In the sinking wagon, Lakota felt cold mud pulling hungrily at his legs with patient malevolence. His wounded side screamed with white-hot agony with each tiny movement. Fever made the entire world shimmer and waver like heat rising from summer stone. His hands shook uncontrollably. His vision kept doubling and tripling into overlapping images that made no sense. The thought of making some kind of miraculous long-distance shot from here, hitting a small moving target at significant range, while burning with infection and barely conscious, was not just difficult, but completely absurd and impossible. But 3 hours earlier, while helping to load the barely conscious Lakota into the wagon under close guard, Deputy Eric had done something that Franklin's distracted men had failed to notice in their hurry and confidence. He had carefully loosened the critical axle pin on a heavily loaded grain wagon that sat positioned on firmer ground directly above the spot where Franklin would most likely position himself to address his mob and enjoy his moment of triumph. Loosened it just enough with the practiced precision of a man who had grown up working with wagons and understood exactly how they failed, that one good jolt, one startled horse throwing its weight wrong, would finish the sabotage and bring the whole thing crashing down. Lakota understood the plan because Eric had whispered it to him in the wagon during a brief moment when the guards were distracted. He did not need to aim at distant wagon wheels or tiny axle pins he could barely see through fever haze and swimming vision. He just needed to aim at something much, much larger. The skittish mare hitched to that sabotaged grain wagon, a nervous animal already dancing and sidling with alarm at all the nearby gunfire and chaos and screaming. He raised his revolver with hands that shook badly, sighted as carefully as his failing vision would allow. Fired once. The bullet cracked the air sharply near the mare's ear, close enough to absolutely terrify the animal, but not close enough to cause actual injury. The horse reared straight up with a scream of pure panic, eyes rolling white and wild, throwing all her considerable weight violently against the traces and harness. The already weakened wagon lurched hard to one side. The compromised axle pin, stressed far beyond its design limits, sheared completely apart with a sharp metallic crack. The wheel jumped completely free of its axle, and the entire overloaded wagon stacked dangerously high, with heavy barrels and bulging sacks of grain and corn, tilted with terrible inevitability, and began to avalanche down the slope, spilling its massive cargo with gathering deadly momentum. The barrels and sacks crashed down like an avalanche, smashing directly into Franklin's startled horse with the force of a battering ram. The animal reared straight up in absolute terror, front hooves pawing desperately at empty air, completely out of control. Franklin grabbed frantically for reins for the saddle horn, for anything solid to hold on to and save himself. The leather reins snapped cleanly under his panicked grip like rotted threads. Horse and rider together slid backward in terrible slow motion, stumbled on the slick clay, and plunged directly into one of the deep, bottomless mud pockets that dotted the basin like hidden graves waiting to be filled. Franklin thrashed wildly, violently, shouting, incoherently, clawing at mud that offered absolutely no purchase or mercy or hope. His hands found nothing solid, nothing to grip, nothing to save him. The harder and more desperately he fought, the faster the relentless mud pulled him down and under, with patient, inexorable hunger. Men on the bank threw ropes frantically in his direction. But the distance was far too great, and the mud far too deep and far too fast. In less than 60 seconds, barely a single minute from the moment he fell, only Franklin's hat remained visible, floating mockingly on the gray surface, like a grotesque marker for an unmarked grave. Seeing their corrupt leader literally swallowed whole by the earth and faced with a federal marshal's gleaming badge backed by the full weight of territorial law, the mob's courage and bloodlust evaporated instantly, like morning mist under harsh sunlight. Rifles clattered uselessly to the ground in surrender. Hands went up. Rudolph made one final desperate attempt to shoot Milena on the ridge and salvage something from this disaster. Lakota, exhausted beyond measure, bleeding barely conscious vision graying at the edges through his empty revolver with the very last reserves of his fading strength. The heavy weapon spun through the air and struck Rudolph's wrist with bone-shattering force, completely spoiling his aim. The marshal's well-armed men surged forward and seized both Rudolph and the pale, shaking Dorian Kensington as they attempted to flee toward their horses and escape. The dried Snake River kept Sheriff Franklin in its muddy embrace forever. Federal law took the surviving traders and women in chains. By evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of blood and gold, prisoners sat chained in a heavily guarded wagon, awaiting transport to Fort Laramie for proper trial. The rescued women huddled together near a crackling fire on the bank, wrapped in borrowed blankets, slowly beginning to believe they might actually survive this nightmare and see another sunrise. Simple stone cairns marked the spots where the bottomless mud had permanently claimed Franklin and two of his deputies, who had followed their leader too far into treacherous ground and paid the ultimate price. Hugh worked on Lakota's wounds by firelight, carefully cleaning the deep gash in his side, picking out embedded dirt and rock fragments with tweezers stitching torn flesh back together with patient, practiced hands, while Lakota gritted his teeth hard enough to crack and refused to make any sound that might be mistaken for weakness. The fever was dangerously high, the infection spreading with ugly speed. Hugh worked in grim silence, knowing the next 24 hours would determine whether this man lived or died. Milena knelt close beside them on the cold ground. But she was not simply assisting with bandages or holding instruments. She had spread the complete ledger pages from the stolen satchel across a flat boulder and was methodically, relentlessly building the prosecution case with the focused intensity of someone who would not rest or sleep until justice was fully and completely served. She argued with the marshal in low, urgent tones, connecting names to specific towns, dates to documented payments, amounts to individual women who could be identified and hopefully found, constructing an absolutely ironclad case that would reach far beyond purgatory and shut down the whole ring across 3 territories. When Lakota's head began to droop dangerously with exhaustion and blood loss threatening to collapse sideways into the dirt, Milena paused in her work. She pressed her palm firmly against his calloused, blood-stained hand and spoke with quiet but absolute intensity. "Squeeze my hand when I count to 5. Do you understand me, every 5 seconds you squeeze. Do not stop. Her voice was steady, brooking absolutely no argument or discussion. It was simultaneously a medical test to monitor his rapidly fading consciousness and an unspoken command from someone who refused to let him slip away. Stay here. Keep fighting. Do not leave us. Do not leave me. He managed to squeeze. Weakly, barely perceptible, but it was there. A response. Evidence of life and will. After several long minutes, his fever-bright eyes found hers through the gathering darkness. He said nothing. She said nothing. But something passed between them in that shared silence, something that had been built slowly over days of shared survival, of watching each other's backs, of making desperate plans in jail cells, and choosing to stand rather than run. Not love, not yet, perhaps not ever in any way that could be easily named or categorized, but something real and earned and worth protecting. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, rough as gravel. You came back. Of course I came back. She did not look away from his eyes. We are not finished yet. Josefina sat with Harriet and the federal marshal on the other side of the fire, studying the complete ledger by the yellow glow of a kerosene lantern that cast dancing shadows across the pages. Page after page of names, dates, transactions recorded in that same neat script. And then buried deep in the middle section, she found what she had been desperately searching for since the moment she understood what these pages represented. Maria Reyes, her younger sister, age 15, Las Cruces, New Mexico territory. Delivered 6 weeks ago to a buyer whose name was listed only as initials. Her hands shook violently. She traced the entry with one trembling finger, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust and blood on her face. I will go south when winter passes and the trails are safe, she said quietly, but with steel beneath every word. I will find her. I will bring her home or die trying. Harriet nodded with equal resolve and determination. Then you spend the winter months learning better English in my schoolroom, practicing your letters and numbers, understanding contracts and legal documents. And when spring finally comes and the mountain passes are clear again, I will ride south to Las Cruces with you. You will absolutely not go alone into that. Tala, the boy, who had been sold twice by men who dealt in human beings and learned to trust no one, sat pressed so close against Odakota's uninjured side that their shoulders touched. He worked with intense, almost ritual concentration to clean the eagle feathers that had been trampled and muddied during the terrible fight. One feather at a time, straightening each bent quill with gentle reverence, wiping away every trace of dirt and dried blood with careful patience, as if restoring these sacred symbols could somehow restore order and meaning and hope to a world that had tried very hard to kill all of them and nearly succeeded. In the weeks that followed, purgatory began to transform in ways both small and profound. The change was not announced with speeches or celebrated with ceremonies. It simply happened slowly, like spring thaw. On the day Odakota's small group prepared to depart west toward Copper Canyon, they rode slowly down the main street one final time. Harriet stood on her schoolhouse steps, not alone, but surrounded by 7 women, some young, some older, all watching with careful attention as she held up a marriage contract and pointed to specific clauses with a wooden pointer explaining in clear, simple language exactly where the deception lay hidden. The women asked questions. Harriet answered patiently. No one looked away when Odakota's group rode past. The blacksmith, a man named Gus, who had been in Franklin's mob that first morning, looked up from his forge as they approached. He hesitated, then slowly lifted his hand and touched the brim of his hat. Not quite an apology, not quite acknowledgement of guilt, but something. Odakota returned the gesture with a slight nod. It was enough. A woman drawing water from the town pump met Milena's eyes and smiled, small, tentative, but genuine. Two children playing in the street stopped to stare at Tala on his pony, not with fear, but with open curiosity. The changes were small, fragile, but real. One cold afternoon in late autumn, when wind drove leaves through Purgatory's streets, and the first hard frost had painted the world in shades of silver, a travel-worn courier arrived at Hugh's clinic with a canvas bag of forwarded mail. Hugh sorted through the letters with methodical care, then walked across the room to where Lakota sat resting, still recovering strength. He handed him one envelope without comment or explanation. The envelope was addressed in careful, painstaking script to any lawful authority who might know the current fate or whereabouts of my brother Lakota of the Lakota people. Lakota stared at it for a long moment, heart hammering violently against his ribs, hard enough to hurt. Then he carefully broke the wax seal with trembling fingers. Inside a letter, written in a woman's careful hand, each word formed with painstaking precision, as if the writer had taught herself English through endless, solitary practice. The woman identified herself as Louisa Hawke, formerly known as Winona, before circumstances and survival had forced her to take a white name for safety. She explained that she had escaped from a marriage camp in Colorado Territory 4 years ago, that she had been searching desperately for any surviving family ever since that she had recently heard persistent rumors, vague and third-hand, but consistent enough to investigate of a Lakota tracker who had broken a major ring that bought and sold women in a town called Purgatory. "If you are truly my brother," the letter continued in that careful script, "then you will remember the drawing we made together on the last morning before the soldiers came. I have carried my half every single day since we were separated. If you still have yours, please send word to Copper Canyon. I will wait." Folded carefully inside was a torn scrap of yellowed paper edges, worn soft from years of carrying. On it, drawn in a child's hand, half a horse, half a sun, a stick figure with long hair. Lakota sat absolutely motionless. His hand moved almost unconsciously to the beaded pouch at his throat, and the pouch he had touched briefly that first night when he saw the drowning women, the gesture so quick Milena had barely noticed it then, but remembered it now, with sudden piercing clarity. From the pouch, he drew a matching scrap torn along the same jagged edge. He laid the two halves on Hugh's table. They fit perfectly. The horse was whole, the sun complete. Brother and sister reunited on paper across 4 years of separation and searching. Milena stood behind him, one hand resting lightly on his shoulder. She said nothing. There was nothing that needed saying. That night, she spread Hugh's best map across the table. Copper Canyon was a distant dot beyond mountains and desert. "Can you track a place you have never seen?" she asked. His hand covered hers on the map. "If you are there to do the talking, I can track the wind." They rode out 3 days later, Lakota, Milena, Tala, with Josefina and Harriet following in a wagon bound for Las Cruces. The journey west took 6 brutal weeks through early winter cold. When they finally reached Copper Canyon, snow lay thick and smoke rose from scattered chimneys. Lakota stood in the street, holding the torn drawing, suddenly uncertain how to proceed. A door opened. A woman stepped onto a narrow porch. She was older, worn thin by survival, but her eyes were the same. Winona. Louisa now. She held up her half of the drawing. Brother and sister stood 50 feet apart, neither moving, neither speaking, just holding the two halves of a promise made by children who could not have imagined the terrible roads that would lead them back to this moment. Around them, the town continued its daily rhythms, indifferent to miracles. "Lakota." Her voice barely carried. A question. A prayer. "Yes." She walked toward him through the snow. Not running, just walking as if afraid sudden movement might shatter this. When she reached him, they pressed the torn edges together. Perfect fit. Then she collapsed into his arms and wept. Not from sorrow, from relief so deep it had no bottom. He held her carefully, mindful of his still healing wounds, and felt his own tears freeze on his face. Behind them, Milena and Tala waited at a respectful distance. That night in Louisa's small cabin, they told the story. Lakota spoke haltingly about tracking, about finding 3 women in mud, about nearly hanging. Milena explained the ledger, the arrests, the women freed. Tala sat by the fire, finally safe. Louisa wept again, not from pain, but from knowing the nightmare that had claimed her had been fought. Morning came cold and bright. "What will you do?" Louisa asked her brother. Lakota looked at Milena, at Tala, at the mountains beyond. "The work continues. There are still women being sold, still battles that need fighting." Louisa touched his arm. "Then go. But come back when you can. You have family. You have a home." "I will. I swear it." They rode out as the sun climbed over the peaks. The drawing was whole, now safe in Louisa's cabin. Behind them, Copper Canyon disappeared behind the mountains. Ahead, the trail stretched toward new territories, new fights. They rode together, a warrior carrying his people's strength, a survivor who had turned trauma to steel, a boy learning trust, carrying what they had endured and the hope of what they might accomplish. The world remained vast and unforgiving, but it had made room for justice, for reunion, for the possibility that the lost could be found. And that was worth everything.